Hello, I'm Lorraine Weiss. I'm the Education Coordinator at Shaker Heritage Society, and I'm joined by my colleagues at Hancock Shaker Village, Sarah Margolis-Pineo, who is the curator, and Cindy Dickinson, who is the Director of Education. And we're going to be talking about the Shakers today, the very unique and very important slice of American history. So you might be familiar with certain Shaker things, their furniture, their round boxes, the simple gift song. Perhaps you've worn a Shaker stitch sweater, but there's much more to this amazing communal society. It began in the 1750s in Manchester, England. The Shakers were a Christian sect. They broke away from the Quakers, and they inherited from the Quakers two important aspects. One was their pacifism, and another was that women were allowed to participate fully in services. This is very different from other religions and very important for this particular religion. There is a young woman named Anne Lee, who was a mill worker, who joins the congregation, and she soon becomes recognized as a leader because of her spirituality and the strength of her visions and dreams. Now, because of their ecstatic form of worship, which involved singing and dancing, the group was not appreciated in Manchester. They were often arrested and fined for breach of the peace. They decide, as so many other groups have, to emigrate to America to be able to practice their religion freely. And so they land in New York City in 1774, and 2 years later, they make their way up to a site just north of Albany, New York, which was known as Niskayuna at the time, also Watervliet. Those are the two historic names of our community. It's also in the town of Colony, and it has an Albany mailing address. So it's a little confusing, but this is the first Shaker settlement in the US. It's a time of great religious experimentation in the US, great religious revival and spiritual revival. Then people find out that there is this group here outside of Albany, and they begin to come visit Anne Lee and her followers. They're seeking a new path to salvation. And eventually Anne Lee decides to go on a missionary journey throughout New England, going to a variety of communities. This lasts for 2 years. The places she visits are places that will eventually become some of the 22 Shaker communities that are eventually established in the United States, mainly in the Northeast, but also as far west as Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio. And you can see that Hancock was the third community established. There is one community still today at Sabbath Day Lake, Maine. There are 3 Shakers in that community. So while she was just in the US for 10 years before her death, Mother Anne Lee established this really remarkable communal society. The people who took over from her began to gather these communities and really codify this growing religion. And here are some core beliefs. Pacifism again, confession of sins. Celibacy was very important. Again, they're seeking a path to salvation. And so the approach to living a pure life involved celibacy. They have a view of God as being both male and female. This leads to a belief that all men and women are created equal and all races are created equal. And again, this is the 1750s and late 1700s, revolutionary. They have a devotion to industry and perfection in their everyday lives, that their worship is part of what they do every day. We might call it mindfulness today. They come to view the way of forming these religious groups is a communal approach, ownership of property, a communal way of life. And in doing that, they separate themselves physically from the outside world. Here in Albany, there are 4 families, which is what they call their villages, that are eventually settled within a mile. We are the church family. That is the one site that remains today that's open to the public, Shaker Heritage Society. And here it is in the 1868. So James Meacham and Lucy Wright are 2 leaders who follow Mother Anne Lee. Lucy Wright will eventually be the head of the Shaker religion for 25 years. It's rather unusual to have a female head of a religion. And they again shape this communal society. So they're separate, but they're not isolated from the outside world. They are very much connected through their economy, through their spirituality. People are interested in the Shakers. They are also interested in their innovations. And as a matter of fact, you are looking at the meeting house here. This is actually what's called the World's Door. The world was actually allowed to come watch their services, which they called meetings. They are creating a heaven on earth, a utopia, which is why we called this a Utopian Christmas. And they did this again by a communal approach to life where men and women were equal. They share authority at 3 key levels. One is the ministers, the key administration, the elders, ministers, they're the religious leaders of the community. The trustees are the business leaders of the community. They're the ones who conduct the outside business with the outside world. And then you have the deacon and deaconesses, and they are running the everyday affairs. I call them the HR department. So they're running everything from who's living where, who is working, they're rotating chores, and they're running the various industries of the community. And again, their economy was very much focused on the outside world to a certain degree, and they're known for several key innovations. At Water of Elite in the 1790s, the Shakers began to pack seeds for sale in small envelopes, and they grow a huge variety of various vegetables and flowers for the production of the seeds, and go on these amazing sales routes to deliver to the middlemen who were selling the seeds. In the 1790s, Theodore Bates, who is at the Water of Elite Church family, invents the flat broom. He sees that if he takes a round group of bristles and flattens it in a vise, he can stitch it into a more efficient shape. And again, the Shakers were interested in more efficient ways of working, making work more efficient and easier. The rectangular shape is the one we're familiar with today. It's a much more efficient shape to sweep with than a round broom. And you'll remember that when you're cleaning up after your holiday meals this year. So the broom industry becomes a huge industry, not only for the Water of Elite families, but for other Shaker communities also. The material used is a type of sorghum called broom corn. The other important industry is one that starts at Mount Lebanon in 1800. The Shakers are credited with the first herbal medicine industry. And again, they are growing acres and acres of herbs and flowers and various plants to produce extracts, dried herbs, and pills. By 1860, the Water of Elite Shakers are selling almost 300 different herbs, extracts, and pills to the world. So a huge industry for a number of Shaker communities. And of course, there are many other items. You might be familiar, of course, with the Shaker furniture industry. Mount Lebanon was a key center for that. The sisters produced huge quantities of textiles for sale, also canned goods and farm products. And appropriately enough, they also produced a number of other gift items for sale. Here's an 1874 ad in a Utica paper advertising the items for sale for Christmas at the various Shaker stores. So here in 1838, you have the Water of Elite Church family, and you can see this is a planned community. Here's the mill pond with the mill. You have an orchard here. You have a hog pasture, the botanical garden, which was the herb garden, the seed and sauce garden here, grassland. So you have a core of residential and industrial buildings, and then you have the agricultural buildings out on the outlying area. The Shakers are producing a wide variety of vegetables and livestock for their own use, and also to a certain degree sale to the outside world. And everybody is involved, the men, women, and children. Now, I mentioned this is a celibate community. They are relying on converts, and they are also taking in a huge number of orphans and young children who are also indentured to the Shakers. So here we have young boys on the farm. They're posed by the photographer, by the way. Here is Eldris Anna Case and a group of young girls and young women who are processing corn. And here's a group of bean pickers in the 1920s. So everybody played a role in the production of food. In fact, you could really look upon this as one of their industries. It certainly was a big challenge to feed large numbers of people, as Sarah will talk about. At the height of the community in Water of Elite, there are about 350 people among the 4 families. And it, again, relies on collaboration of brethren and sisters. Everybody helped. The brothers were also very active in creating efficient workspaces for the sisters. And again, you'll see that in a few minutes. They're also, they have the same innovative approach to cooking. The same idea about inventions. George Price invents the pea sheller here at Watervliet, and they're also talking about an improved apple peeler at one point. They become famous for their well-balanced, tasty, and healthy food. And they used the food pyramid before we even knew of such a thing. There is a visitor in 1888 who leaves this account. I will simply say that I never understood before to what perfection the art of cooking can be brought. Now I want you to get my exact meaning. There was nothing rich about the meal in the English or French sense. It was plain cooking, made delicious to the palate, tempting to the eye, and, as we found, in the highest degree, digestible and nutritious. So plainly cooked, but bountiful for the most part. I should note too that we're talking about 22 communities over a period of time. So things are certainly varied among the various communities, and certainly there were lean and fat years, certainly. So we're giving you a snapshot in time of just two of these communities. One important thing at the meals, you'll find variety of food, meats, vegetables, and always pie. And certainly apple pie was very important here, and apple products, applesauce, cider, and so forth. Here's our orchard today, Shaker Heritage Society, and we still have some unusual varieties of apples. These are sheep nose apples here. And I will hand it off to Sarah, who will talk to you about how all of this bounty was actually turned into meals for the Shakers.
Okay, thank you so much, Lorraine. My name is Sarah Margolis-Pineo. I am the curator at Hancock Shaker Village in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Currently, Hancock is a living history museum on 750 acres in the Berkshires in Western Mass. We consist of 20 historic buildings dating back as far as 1783. Although the Shakers officially formalized this community in 1790 and lived here up until 1960, at which point the remaining Shaker sisters on the site sold the property to the nonprofit entity that would come to found the museum. And so we have sustained as such ever since. Where I would like to locate us today on our campus is this building here, which is our historic 1830 brick dwelling. This was essentially our dormitory here on our campus. And like Lorraine's community, the Hancock Shaker community consisted of 6 Shaker families. This is the dormitory for the Central Church family, which was really the heart of our campus and is still today as a museum. This is how the brick dwelling looks at this time of year. This is a shot in the 1930s in the winter. And this is the side of the building where currently we welcome visitors today, and it is historically the kitchen. So you can see 2 Shaker sisters and 1 young girl standing outside the doorway to the kitchen. When you entered the kitchen in the early 20th century, this is what you would have seen. And from the time that the Shakers built the building in 1830 to this photograph in 1926, quite a bit of the equipment has been updated, which the museum has since reverted to the earlier forms. And so this is what you would see today walking into the historic brick dwelling kitchen. And I think what is perhaps most interesting for the sake of this talk is our cooking equipment, some of which what you see here, a flat top of plancha, as well as one of our arch kettles, as they're called, this sort of round cauldron type thing that was used for steaming or frying. And then here we also have some of our bake ovens, as well as another arch kettle in that view. Feeding such a large number of people was more like managing a commercial kitchen than cooking for an average household. And so the designs of the kitchen tools and equipment reflects the quantity of food produced. In the museum today, you'll see oversized mixing bowls, dough trough, a towering cooling rack, all of which help the Shaker just to produce their supply of bread for the day. Large casks, barrels, and crocks help to store and preserve food, and cutting tables with attached blades, mechanical apple peelers, all expedited prep work. Cylindrical or barrel-shaped pie oven allowed many pies to bake evenly all at once, and that's actually out of the photograph, but you can see it if you visit the museum. The kitchen deaconesses were still skilled cooks who managed the culinary work and oversaw a staff of sisters and girls. Unlike other work assignments, which rotated monthly, the kitchen deaconesses were stationary. They were appointed to produce wholesome and nourishing meals for the church family. At a time when the typical American diet revolved around fatty meats and starch, the Shakers emphasized natural whole foods such as grains, fruits, vegetables, herbs, lean meat, and dairy products, mostly from the Shakers' own farm, orchards, and gardens. Elder William Deming was the architect and designer of the brick dwelling, and he was particularly very prodigiously proud of this kitchen. From the stone floors and sinks to the iron stoves, boilers, and arch kettles, Deming designed the kitchen to be efficient and safe. It was state of the art at the time and just a really efficient facility for producing daily meals of up to 100 Shakers who lived in this building. About this brick dwelling kitchen, he wrote, "The cookroom is very convenient. We have excellent water from a never-failing spring that is conveyed into the cookroom in 3 different places and 2 places in the second loft. There are 2 excellent ovens made on an improved plan which bake 4 different settings and 1 heating. Also, the arch kettles are of a new plan of my own invention and which proves to be the best ever seen about here." In the 1990s, we had an interpreter use the brick dwelling kitchen as it was meant to be by the Shakers, and so this is a short video clip illustrating how this equipment works.
This is one of the arch kettles that Elder William wrote about, with the lid that's affixed to the back of the kettle and the steam vent carrying the steam from the kettle off to the chimney. Now, when the building was built, I don't think they had piped water directly to the kettles yet, but at some point later on they did. And we'll fill the kettle by just opening the tap. Now we have this one set up for steaming because we're going to be doing steamed bread pudding and steamed brown bread in this kettle. Now the fire is directly underneath the kettle, and it's time to light this because it'll take a long time for all the water in the kettle to get up to temperature for steaming. This is one of the 2 bake ovens that William Deming talks about, built on the new improved plan that'll bake 4 settings at 1 heating. The bake oven is heated by building a fairly small hot fire, right in the baking chamber. And then as we feed it, we move it around inside the baking chamber to heat all the bricks. This is a huge oven compared to most household ovens in the early 19th century, because of course most households didn't have 85 to 100 people living in them. This is at least 6 feet deep and probably about something like 5 or 6 feet wide at the widest point. So it takes about 3 hours to get the fire to all the different places inside the oven. This is more like a standard modern gas oven, except that it's not gas-fired, it's wood-fired. There's the wood boxes, the firebox is underneath. There's a baffle between the firebox and the oven so that it doesn't just heat the bottom of the oven. Instead, the flue from the firebox is a channel in the brickwork that goes all the way around outside the oven and then off to the chimney on this side and carries it off. We don't even know quite where it goes. But so that way the hot smoke circulates around the entire oven and heats the whole shell. And it's a double-walled shell, so there's a layer of air even between that hot smoke so that would then equalize the temperature. And it works quite well.
And so, as Lorraine mentioned, efficiency and innovation were key, not only with the cooking equipment, but with food preservation as well. And so here you're looking into the mid-19th century cellar. And at the time, the storerooms would have been crowded with supplies, grains from the North Family gristmill, root vegetables, dried beans, apples, dairy products, nuts, fragrant herbs, eggs, and pasture-raised meat. The coldest area was reserved for butter, milk, and wheels of cheese from the dairy, and the other rooms were dedicated to dry storage, canned goods, preserved foods, and casks of distilled and fermented liquids like cider and vinegar. Connecting the kitchen, which is on the lowest level, the cellar level of the building, to the dining room, which is one level above, are these very clever sliding cupboards, or dumbwaiters as we'd call them today. There is one on either side, and essentially they're closet size with multiple shelves that were used for ferrying plates of food and dirty dishes up and down from the dining room above, which is up here. And so they're very discreetly contained within these built-in cupboards, which are very, very Shaker in their design. This is what our dining room looks like today, and when the Shakers occupied this building, meals were a really important part of daily life. In contrast to the relative scarcity oftentimes in the world, food at Hancock was plentiful, providing ample nourishment for body and spirit. And so up to 100 Shakers also dine in this room daily. You can see our bell pull on the left-hand side of the screen towards the ceiling. After the bell rang, for breakfast would be at 6:30 a.m., dinner at 12 noon, and then supper at 6 p.m. The Shakers would enter and sit according to gender, brethren on the east and sisters on the west. After a short prayer, the dining room remained silent. Beyond the clatter of plates, meals were understood to be the time for giving thanks and for spiritual contemplation. When the community at Hancock first started in the late 18th century, Shaker cuisine was really defined by just a mission to survive. Here at Hancock, we have a really lovely detailed account provided by Sister Rebecca Clark, who wrote in 1791, just 1 year after the formal formation of the Hancock community. Our food was very scanty, but what we had to eat, we ate with thankful hearts. For breakfast and supper, we lived mostly on bean porridge and water porridge. Monday morning, we had a little wheat tea, and once a week, a piece of cheese. Wheat bread was very scarce, and when we had butter, it was spread on the bread before it came to the table. Our dinners were generally boiled. Once in a while, we had a little milk, but this was a great rarity. As Shaker communities became established and more industrious into the 19th century, abundance in the fields, gardens, barns, and orchards led to abundance in pantries, kitchens, dining rooms, and stomachs. As an agrarian community, much of the Shaker diet can be surmised from agricultural records. Economic ledgers fill in ingredients that were purchased, things like molasses, citrus, fish, spice, etc. And written descriptions recorded by the Shakers also help us with this information as well. Visitors to Shaker communities have provided some particularly animated and reverent descriptions of mealtimes. Hospitality was a core component to Shakerism, and communities were, for the most part, welcoming to visiting diners. There's a great visiting account from 1855 written in the New York Times that describes, "But what a lunch! There was cold boiled meat and roast meat in abundance. There was mush and a style of pudding that we had never seen before. Hominy, boiled sap, and cracked corn with milk that comes from cows. There was butter, yellow as gold, and butter white from its late working, according to the pastures that the cows fed on. The bread was, quote, homemade, of the sort that bakers can't make, and the biscuits threatened to rival the bread in size. There were pumpkin pies and apple pies and dried apple pies with plenty of allspice in. So when we arose from our lunch, we were stuffed to that such a degree that we have not given a fig for the best dinner ever planned by mortal man." In addition to being a very successful tool for recruitment, food was a direct conduit to the divine for the Shakers. It was a product of Shaker labor and thereby a product of faith, hands to work, hearts to God, as Mother Ann said. I imagine that the silent mealtimes, while efficient and time-saving without chatter, serve the purpose of making space for spiritual contemplation, specifically thanks for the bounty of God's earth and skilled Shaker hands. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Cindy.
Thank you, Sarah. So when we think about the Shakers and Christmas, it's good to remember, as Lorraine said, that the Shakers are a Christian group, a Protestant group, and they would have had Christmas on their calendar. But for the Shakers, if we think of their official name, they're known today as the United Society of Shakers, and they're known informally to us as the Shakers. But their original name was the United Society of Believers in Christ's second appearing. And that second appearing to them was the figure of Mother Ann Lee, whom Lorraine described earlier. So the highlights of the Shaker calendar were Mother Ann's birthday, which was February 29th, leap day, and then Arrival Day, August 6th, the day that the little band of Shakers arrived from England into New York. But they knew that Christmas was a day that they needed to acknowledge. And so they have a delightful origin story that I'd like to share with you. When the first Shakers had settled at Niskayuna, outside Albany, New York, Sister Hannah Hocknell had decided that no special celebrations should be observed on Christmas Day. So on that day, Sister Hannah arose and began to dress for a day's work at washing and house cleaning. For some unaccountable reason, she could not get her shoes on. Some peculiar operation prevented her each time she tried. Mother Ann, quick to see a spiritual meaning in everything, said this was a sign, as spoken of in Exodus. Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Mother Ann recognized Hannah's cleaning gift in appointing that the labor of the day should be cleaning of the spiritual house and garments. She also appointed that the day be yearly kept and devoted to spiritual purposes. So for most of the rest of the 18th century and much of the 19th century, the Shakers observed a Day of Atonement in the week preceding Christmas. Christmas itself was a day of fasting, not of feasting. On this day, each individual Shaker reflected personally on their deeds during the past year in order to make an honest and penitent approach to the Christ spirit on Christmas Day. At this time, the Shakers would also gather what few personal possessions they had and offer a collective gift to the poor in their communities. Also during these decades, the Shakers would write a special song for Christmas. And these songs would not be ones we would recognize out when we're out shopping in the mall. They really focused on the celebration of the Christ spirit as opposed to sort of the facts of the nativity in Bethlehem or the typical festivities of the season. The custom of writing and singing a special song for Christmas fell to a few Shakers who would prepare the song and then would awaken their brothers and sisters at 4:30 or 5 a.m. On Christmas morning, singing the song and inviting others to walk through the dwelling house with them. By the mid-19th century, the acknowledgement of the way that Christmas was celebrated in the outside world, that world that Lorraine mentioned the Shakers really had removed themselves from, it became important to think about the opportunity to celebrate more as those outside of the Shaker world commemorated the holiday, in part to attract more believers at a time when the Shaker population was declining. The more they could show that they had some similarities to the world outside was important. So at Hancock, you see some pictures here of decorating with greens, tinsel, paper birds, some popcorn. They also, at one point, because their dwelling was filled with wonderful Shaker cast iron stoves, they purchased a cardboard fireplace so that they would have some place to hang their stockings. And they also celebrated a little bit more with the foods that we think of today. So they would bake gingerbread or drink hot cider. They might enjoy some cakes and nuts and candies. They also began to put on Christmas pageants. These are photographs from the early 20th century. Christmas pageants were not unique to the Shakers. They sometimes purchased scripts from the outside world or wrote their own. And in an exchange of community spirit, they would invite Shakers from nearby Mount Lebanon, the Mount Lebanon community in New York, to attend these pageants. And in fact, sometimes the Hancock Shakers went to Mount Lebanon. We have a recording in 1892, a note that the Hancock Shakers visited Mount Lebanon for a day of entertainment, which consisted of speeches, dialogues, recitations, rich vocal and instrumental music, and then a royal banquet was served with unleavened bread, cakes, nuts, candy, and toothsome dainties. Lorraine has some special anecdotes to add about the Shaker celebration at Watervliet.
Just to mirror what Cindy mentioned, this is at first a purely religious holiday, and then it evolves, and we see that in the journal entries. So they're talking about offering gifts to the poor. They're talking about being a very sacred day, having 2 meetings, which is what they call their worship services, for 6.5 hours. And then in the 1860s, you start to see that food becomes a part of the celebration. So here we have oysters for dinner. And later on, they are talking about candy and other special foods. And they're also talking about possibly overeating. So that's something that we become familiar with too these days. So here we are, had a good meeting and more for the mouth than the stomach could bear, which some found out.
I think this kind of sums up the purpose of Christmas for the Shakers throughout the centuries that they have been celebrating it. And this is from 1897. We have exchanged the Merry Christmas greetings and have felt the renewal of the Christ spirit, a new birth into the divine life so many years ago personified. Well, as Lorraine said, feasting did become part of what had been a fasting holiday. And so we want to close our presentation with a recipe for you that features apples. We've mentioned apples quite a bit this afternoon. And so this is a simple apple batter pudding recipe that those of you in the audience who might be culinarily challenged in the kitchen can master with no difficulty. And those of you who already have your chef's hats, give it a try. It's a tasty, toothsome way to get into the shaker life. So it's just a simple recipe featuring apples. You chop them up, mix them with some brown sugar, cinnamon, and nutmeg. Put them in a shaker Pyrex container or a pudding dish of your choosing. You'll dot that with butter and add some water. And then you make the pudding, which is simply some flour and a bit more sugar, melted butter and eggs. And then you pour that over your apple mixture. And you bake it first at a high temperature, and then you drop the temperature and let it finish baking. You're looking for the apples to be the consistency that you like. What's not to be improved with a sauce? So you can try our lemon sauce from one of our Hancock trustees, Frances Hall, who was known for her confections. The recipe also suggests trying it with a vanilla sauce, or I can attest from personal experience that ice cream or whipped cream would taste good on it too. And we'll be making this recipe available to you along with a few others. So I turn it back to Lorraine for some final words.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to work with both of you, and it's been fun to be with you all today. We have given you just a little taste, shall we say, of Shaker history. We hope that you are interested in exploring more, both at either of our sites and online also.